Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Privileged to have a chance to talk to Stephan Feuchtwang, who I've known over the years. Stephan, tell me where and when you were born.
I was born in Berlin in 1937, November. My father had just come out of jail, where he had been tried, after he had been tried and found not guilty for his having, he was accused of smuggling gold out of the country, which was, I think, because he'd been helping Jews leave Germany. And he had Austrian nationality, so he had a certain amount of immunity, and it wasn't for under the SS, it was just the ordinary law, the police law. And he had an alibi that he stuck to so well that he got off, whereas his co-accusees didn't. Anyway,
How long was he in jail?
So most of my mother's pregnancy, which made it very distressful. And so I had a very traumatic birth for her, not for me. And 6 months later, at Anschluss, that's the annexation of Austria, my father knew that he had no longer any immunity. He said, "We leave tonight," on that day, and he was right, because we went to Holland to his sister where she was living, and the Gestapo came the next morning to round us up, but we weren't there any longer. So then I we spent a year in Holland and then to London.
Okay, let's go back a little bit, because it's always rather interesting to hear about people's family a bit further back as anthropologists, ancestors. Did you know any of your grandparents at all?
Never, no, I didn't. Only my mother's mother, called Mutter. Sorry, I called her Mutter. And she I knew because she had come to visit us in London, so I knew her from very early on. And then she returned, believe it or not, to Germany, where she knew what was happening. And she spent the war there. My mother was not, she had a Jewish father, but her mother was not Jewish, so Miss Mutter was not Jewish. And she went back to Berlin and then lived out the war actually in Austria for the last few years. But so she I knew, and I knew her afterwards, because in 1947 we went, my mother and I, my first big trip by train to Switzerland and then Austria, where we met my grandmother. So she I knew, but my other grandparents I didn't ever know.
What was on those two sides, the main sort of occupation?
My grandfather, my father's father, was the chief rabbi of Vienna.
Really?
But he'd already died. He died in 36. And a natural death, I mean, no persecution. And I went to visit his grave in Vienna at the European Association of Social Anthropologists meeting when he was there, for the first and only time. But I'd been to visit his father's grave, who was the rabbi of a place called Nikolsburg. It's now called Mikolov. It's in Moravia, not very far from Vienna. And so that's what they were, sort of rabbis, at least up to 2 generations before my father. And not good to admit this for an anthropologist, but I don't know what my grandfather's wife, my grandmother, did. My mother's mother was a very independent woman, whom I sort of take as a kind of heroine. She was a pacifist and a Rosa Luxemburgist in the First World War. She ran an art gallery in Unter den Linden, the big avenue in Berlin, and brought up all her children to be basically tolerant and cosmopolitan, and gave each of them an Aryan and a biblical name to sort of mix the. She was very oddly keen, as people of that generation were, to know what the real history of Shakespeare was. So that was her, and her husband. She had two husbands, but my mother's father was a solicitor. No, what was he? A businessman, and then she remarried the solicitor for the UFA film studios in Berlin. So that's their occupations. My mother, then, my father was a businessman and came to England through his business contacts.
What kind of business?
Patent broker, I knew it as I'm trying not to say it by rote, but I knew it as a child. A patent broker and an industrial advisor. And he brokered patents, and so he had contact with scientists, but mainly he'd been quite successful in Germany as an asset stripper, as I now call it, working for somebody who bought up other places, and he calculated on whether or not they were worth keeping, and the rest would strip. Mainly in Eastern, what we now call Eastern Europe, Central Europe. And he came to this country and he went on doing business. But during the war he was interned, and my mother's built up a relationship with another person, another man, who was a publisher and with whom she got a job. And they became the founders of the firm Thames and Hudson, the publishing firm.
And tell me something about their character. Your mother and father's character, personality, etc.
Well, my father was quite authoritarian, but extremely charming. So that as a child, I sort of have, because I've had 3 children and grandchildren, several of them, seem to have an affinity with babies. I mean, I get on well with babies. And I think I get that from my father, because I think he must have had too. I certainly know that my mother did not get on well with babies. So when I had my children and then their children, I could see how awkward she was with young children. I thought, that's odd. She must have been that with me too, I suddenly realised. So he was charming and entertaining, and then very authoritarian after a certain age. I could see that with he married again too, and so with my half brother and sister, you could see that happening. And I rebelled against his authority, I have to say, although I didn't spend much time at home. I was at boarding school all my childhood. But and sort of distanced myself from him, and only came close to him again when I became a young adult, and did get very close to him again before he then died. He died quite early, in 1966. So he was only 67 years old. My mother lived on much longer, and I lived with her as a child, although I was at boarding school. They separated about it. And she's a much more passionate, not quite bohemian, but everything that we tried to do as children, she said, oh, we did that in the 1920s. That sort of, but also very passionate about her work and about almost everything. She was also extremely fashionably well dressed and became a fairly grand lady, though I only sort of cottoned onto that. To me she was just my mother, but as a full adult I suddenly realised this is someone other people are rather frightened of. And I wasn't. And so she's, I guess I was closer to her than to my father. That's the difference in their character. My father, I felt, in England, was a fairly sad figure. I mean, my mother found herself. She had been, as it were, in Germany enthralled to him. But in England she found herself, and so she blossomed. Whereas my father, I felt, shrank. I mean, he'd had to put up with so much, including jail, but also having to get us to England, and then being interned in the Isle of Man, which he quite enjoyed in the end. He went into the army. But I felt, as a businessman, he'd been defeated.
Were you brought up with any orthodox trappings?
Yes, I was. Yes, good you asked. Oh.
You had a bar mitzvah and so on?
I did. I had an Orthodox bar mitzvah. That's precisely it. But it was a sort of a short period of my life. I went to lessons, Hebrew lessons, in the town where my boarding school was near, Welwyn Garden City. And I went to a rabbi there to learn Hebrew and the Torah that I had to read for my bar mitzvah, from a rabbi unbelievably known. His name is pronounced Rabbi Scripture, but it's written in a Polish way. And so yes, I did an Orthodox bar mitzvah, but habitually in the family it was just Friday evenings. But while I was 3 years before and possibly 2 years after my bar mitzvah, I did go to the high days and holidays to synagogue, but otherwise I didn't go at all. I didn't before and I haven't since. So I'm an atheist, basically.
Yeah, well, we'll come on to that further. I mean, several of the people who I've interviewed who have been Jewish have commented on the fact that they felt that this did give them an odd view of life, that they felt both within society and outside it at the same time. And Simon Chaffer says this, and then when I put it to Lisa Jardine, she said, well, that's so often said, it's a sort of cliche.
But it may be true.
It may be true.
Yes.
Did you?
Yes, I felt that I had to interpret everything. I mean, I went to school, all of which were mainly Christian schools, and so when we were read a lesson in the school services every day, actually, but I felt it wasn't necessarily mine, but I could try to understand it. And I think about why I'm now an anthropologist of ritual and religion, or that I became that, amongst other things. I feel that it was a development of that stance that I had to try to understand something that wasn't part of my family ritual, as it were. And then, of course, I had to understand my family ritual too. But that in that sense of being marginal, but of course, being of German birth during the war in England, Jewish or not, was to be marginalised, and I was quite embarrassed when my mother spoke to me in German on public transport, for instance. I told her to shut up. I mean, I was quite fierce. But I only realised it actually many, many years later in my 40s that I must have been German speaking before I learned English. So before as soon as I went to kindergarten, which was pretty early, I had to learn English.
I mean, it was said by, among others, Evans Pritchard, that when asked why the list of candidates for the professorship at Cambridge consisted entirely of Jews and Catholics, he said I'm afraid, gentlemen, that's because all the good anthropologists are Jewish or Catholic, which is, to a certain extent, there's something in it. I mean, do you think, you've sort of alluded to it, but do you think that being brought up in a great religious tradition did later attract you towards understanding?
No, I think it's the marginality.
Mm.
But even that I think all anthropologists, to some extent, cultivate being marginal, and maybe already inclined in that direction anyway. And politically, I'm fairly much a political animal. I think that the normal stance, insofar as it is political, of an anthropologist is to be an anarchist.
Is to be a...
An anarchist.
Oh, right.
To see things from the grassroots and to hope that there's nothing else, if possible. But and that, in a way, is not to be in the centre, but to be below or at the edge. And I think, and that, I don't know if I was predisposed towards that by my, I mean, that I was predisposed by, I think, my previous life. I'm talking about my previous life before I became an anthropologist. Yeah. And but not, I don't know that, I really don't know enough to see whether I'm typical or not of the histories of other anthropologists of religion, which is what I consider myself to be. But I do consider it that I felt I needed to understand something as an outsider. That were these big religious traditions, including my own. So I didn't feel that much inside it, because I rebelled against my father. But on the other hand, I felt very much at home. In fact, it was a way of making home. Those Friday evenings where I had to do the prayer for the breaking bread, and my mother did the lighting of the candles, and my father did the wine. It's that family occasion that seems very important now, and I think it was then. But again, it was a kind of hidden presence. My public life, and most of my life, was in boarding school, where this was edged out. It was not to be, it wasn't to be part of it, as it were.
Returning just to 2 points there. One is on anarchy. I was thinking of Anarchy Brown, which
yes, quite exactly.
Radcliffe Brown's nickname.
Yes.
But it's often said that anthropologists are anarchic and radical in their own societies because they question everything about it.
Yes.
But in the societies they work in, they become very conservative and preserving the traditions, kind of thing. Is that at all true of you or not?
Yes, I have to admit it is. What I loved in the end about the festivals that I became most interested in Taiwan, and which I then followed through other parts of China, is their exuberance, and in some ways their the colourfulness and the extraordinary richness of both of invention and of the fact that they repeat. And so when I come upon the fact that I have to take into consideration that intellectuals or political leaders or cultural policy in both Taiwan and the mainland of China seek to turn this into cultural heritage, I acknowledge that that's what they're trying to do, but I also resent it. It's because I'd like it, as it were, to bubble up from below as a kind of, as I like to think of it, an anonymous poetry, collective poetry of some kind. And of course it's not anonymous. People, you can actually know who actually introduced this particular ritual or it's quite recent, but in some ways it's embedded in whatever there already was. Whereas when it's reinvented or recomposed as cultural heritage, as a spectacle, or as when a temple is rebuilt as something that tourists can go to, which is quite often done by the temple or management committee themselves. I feel it's wrong, but I do feel that it's artificial. Well, I know it's wrong, but it's no more artificial than the previous one was.
The other question arising, I mean, you threw away the fact that you are an atheist. Have you ever been anything otherwise? And at what age did you know you were an atheist?
I think I always was. I had to ask myself, what is God, all the time? What do people mean by God? But I'm deeply respectful, as well as utterly sceptical, of what people say. They have as their spiritual experiences, including what they say about God or gods. I have a preference for polytheism, but I don't. I come from a psychoanalytically inclined family culture. I mean, my mother was psychoanalyzed, did graphology, which is a Jungian mode, and I'm married to someone who was a psychoanalytic therapist, and her mother was a psychoanalyst. So it's as it were around me. And what Freud calls an oceanic experience, which one of his descriptions of what it is to have to have religiosity, or to have the emotion that goes along with a belief in God. I think I can detect that in myself. I think I can. I don't know whether I've never had an epiphany, but oceanic experiences, if you like, a sense of wonder, as the atheist Richard Dawkins himself has, a sense of wonder about the world, and the sense of it being something bigger. I think that is part of one's human heritage, experience.
Well, we'll probably come back to this, but let's move on now through your life. Is there anything to say about your kindergarten, apart from the fact you learnt English there? Was it in London? It must have been.
It was. There were a number of them, but one was in Oxford, actually, or in above Oxford. My mother and I, because my father was interned, my mother was reliant on friends and relatives. She had no money. So we kept moving from one place to place to live with different people. One was in Headington and in Oxford, and I think that was my first one. I remember only that she trained me to go to the terminus of the bus where the kindergarten was. So I travelled on my own, aged 3 or 4. And it was cold. I can just remember her singing to me an English nursery rhyme, actually. And then I went to the Anna Freud clinic in London, which was terrifying, because the children, after the event, I think because the other children were so disturbed. And I didn't last there for very long. Then there was another one not far from there in London as well. So several. But in all of them I learned English, yes.
Mm. And then you went on to some sort of preparatory school that was boarding or not?
It was boarding, but it wasn't a preparatory school. It was my favourite school, which I do idealise, but without hesitation. It was called Bunce Court.
Bunce?
Bunce, B-U-N-C-E.
Yeah.
It was a school that was run by two German sisters, Anna and Paula Essinger, who, there was a television program about them because some fairly famous people went there, famous Frank Auerbach, the painter, went there, for instance. And it was a remarkable school in which they realized very early, in 1933, the year that Hitler was elected Chancellor, that this, that they couldn't go on. Not because they were Jewish, they're Quaker actually, I think. And so they arranged a school trip, telling all the parents that it was more than just a school trip, and they all agreed, and took all their pupils with them from Germany to England, and then having found a place for them to be in. And that place was Bunce Court, which is a place near Lenham, Kent. And that's where I went, only I didn't go there because by that time they'd been moved, because it was needed, that house was needed for the armed forces, and it was in Shropshire. But yes, I went there, and I was there for 5 years, and then the school went bankrupt. So I then had to move. But it was a co-educational, extremely strict in academic terms, but very progressive in other respects.
Do you remember, were there any teachers at that stage who
inspired me? No, except Paula Essinger, who was very strict with us.
And then you went on from Bunce Court to
a rather grim school called Sherrod's Wood in Welwyn Garden, in Welwyn. The main school was in Welwyn Garden City, but the boarding place was in Welwyn, which was also co-educational, and where I sort of got on, but it was the first time that I came across anti-Semitism and anti-Germanism. And I didn't suffer from it very much because I was fairly able to stand up for myself. But one of my best friends, curiously, was the most anti-Semitic and anti-German, Michael Walter Kelly, whose parents were in the Fabian Society, and he and I were the only two boys who could match the girls, although it was always girls on the top of the class. But we could get sort of second and third, as it were. And we became sort of hostile friends. It was a curious relationship. And he teased me for being German and then occasionally for being Jewish. And that was that school. And then I went to Gordonston, which is...
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh.
Where I got a scholarship. I was my mother, whatever. What was it called now? Anyway, my mother couldn't afford the fees, so they paid towards them. And I was there for the last 4 years of my school. Academically, a disaster.
Really?
Total disaster.
Why not?
Just because the teaching wasn't very good. I mean, in terms of its being a great place for the outdoors life, it was. I really enjoyed the mountains. But I felt deeply frustrated by the school. Frustrated in the sense that they kept on telling us we were being prepared for life, and I wanted life. Prepared for leadership, which I didn't want either.
Were you already showing a particular interest in any kind of intellectual?
At that time, I wanted, following my mother's interests, to either be a psychiatrist or, this is my fancy, pure fancies, both of them, to be a journalist. I felt I wanted to be a journalist. And that was an anthropological instinct, I realized. I just wanted to be able to tell stories about other people. And I had English was my best subject, and I was, the teacher was the headmaster, the teacher of English, and he was something I remember well, because
What, do you remember his name?
Bratton, Mr. Bratton, I forgot what his
Bratton,
first Bratton, B-R-E-R-E-T-O-N. And he taught Browning, Robert Browning, who taught me to love Robert Browning. It wasn't to, I had to do it for O-levels and A-levels, but he gave a real, a sense of enjoyment about it as well, which I picked up. And he also taught us I remember reading not just Shakespeare, but reading Granville Barker on Hamlet and various other things as well for my A-levels, and I think that was quite good. Although I didn't do at all well at the A-levels. I did maths, French and English at A-levels and failed. No, I got the English, but failed the other two. And then I joined the army because I couldn't get into university.
Well, let's go back to just, at school, were there any other activities? You said you were quite tough and so on. You keen on games?
No, long distance running, yes, but I didn't particularly enjoy it. I know what I really did enjoy, and it became a habit of life, was being in the mountains. I loved that. That was quite tough. It was very cold.
Rock climbing or
No,
walking?
it was just walking in the Cairngorms there, and the Cairngorms are very bald and very cold and windy. And I learned to ski as part of these expeditions in the winter into the Cairngorms. And then on one run I hit some ice and broke the ski and tore a ligament in my knee, and didn't ski after that at all. But I enjoyed it. I must say I felt quite gripped by the mountains.
What about other things like music or...
Yes. Thank you for asking that. That was very important. I learned the violin from a very early age. I think I must have been 8 when I started. And at Gordonston there was a very good teacher. She herself was Frau Lachmann was her name, and she had been a student with Hindemith, the composer, who was a viola player.
How do you spell her name?
Lachmann, L-A-C-H-M-A-N. And I know her given name because other people from later in life told me she was called Susie Lachmann. But I think I just called her Miss Lachmann. Well, maybe we all called her Frau Lachmann, I think. Yeah. Anyway, she was a very fierce teacher of violin, and then I took up the viola. That's why I know about Hindemith and his being a viola player. And I played in the orchestra as a viola player, and played chamber music, and that was a glorious experience. I gave that up too when I got to Oxford, but it was a glorious experience. I just was never good enough to really keep going.
But have you continued to love music? Or
Yes, absolutely.
What in particular?
Well, I think by the time I had left school, when I was at school, my closest friend at Gordonston was a Hungarian called Stephan Horthy, grandson of the Admiral Horthy who won Hungary in the war. And he and I listened to Mahler symphonies. I remember just on our own in the study that we had. And I could hear others who were playing things like Salad Days and traditional jazz. which I didn't like. I thought it was just too uninventive, at least what they played was. But as soon as I left, I got very interested in modern jazz, and almost exclusively so. And then got back into classical music again.
Do some people write to music or
Yes,
think to music?
I know it's wrong, but I do. I know I should really be listening, because this is something that could be quite deep. But I do actually. Now I don't so much, but I did most of my life. I have done. Yeah.
Well, Simon Schaffer, who I interviewed, uses music as a kind of wall round him. He plays it fairly loud round him, and that deadens
Everything else. Yeah.
And he writes to music like
Yes.
that. But some people use it, I mean, listen to it, and then write to be inspired by the strong emotions it churns up.
I think for me, it's when I'm writing, I get in some ways hyperactive. What I'm doing excites me too much, and it's almost as if I want to get away from it, which I can then use. If I've got the music on, I can then listen to the music and then get back to what I'm writing, or make a cup of coffee or whatever. But the music in itself isn't usually an inspiration.
So you went into the army?
I was conscripted. I mean, I was in the last years of the national service. Yes, and that was not a terribly formative, but a vivid experience. I went in for the tests for officer training and failed them, which I'm extremely pleased about. I mean, pleased because I think it would have been horrible to be cooped up in an officer's mess. It would have been too much more like boarding school. I mean, there are other aspects in which my boarding school experience meant that I didn't suffer as much from having to live in barracks as some of the others did. But I lived for a whole year in Aldershot of all places, right? I mean, learning to type. I was in the army service course, so I learned shorthand typing. I'm shorthand writing and typing. That was I think one thing was really very good about that was that I met a huge variety of people. I mean, ordinary people that I would never have met otherwise. And the only similar experience I get now is if I have to go into hospital, in a public ward. But at that time I just met people who were, I don't know, from all walks of life, but mainly working class. And I wouldn't have ever been able to know how to get on with them. I mean, now our children went to comprehensive school, which was, so they had that experience for much longer than I did, but I had it for those 2 years. And then I went into, I got a position. I dreaded being sent to Germany, actually, because, not because it was Germany, but I wanted to be in the intelligence corps. I sort of said to the person I had to report to on conscription, that was my aim. He said, yes, but you have to join another one first, which was no doubt a way of just easing me out of it, to the Royal Army Service Corps. But I'd wanted to, I don't know, the glamour of being in intelligence of some kind. And I know then, when I got to Oxford, I met people who'd done Chinese while they were in the services, as part of being in intelligence. And I didn't know quite what it was, but I'd wanted it, and it didn't happen. And going to Germany was just actually having to make so much effort at looking smart to get out into the town that I was told that it was dreadful to go there, because you could never get out of the barracks. And I got instead posted to Stanmore in London, where I was the personal assistant to the Deputy Director of Army Legal Services, a slightly elevated typist, and I typed out charges to other poor soldiers in Shepton Mallet and other places like that. Yeah, and in the meantime I lived at home, put on a uniform once a week to collect my pay, and in the meantime went to the Guildhall School of Music and Drama where I learned.
Did you?
Yes, because I wanted to do composition.
Sarah went there too.
Right.
My wife.
Did she? Right.
She'll be
And I got interested in acting there as well as in composition, so that was
Seems a very light regime that you just have to turn up once a week in a uniform and the rest
I
of
had
the
to
time.
turn up all the other time in ordinary clothes.
Oh, I see. But how did you do the Guildhall as well? In the
In
evening?
evenings, it was evenings, yeah. And I wasn't registered for a degree, I just wanted to do the classes. And I wanted to compose. By that time I got interested in jazz, and I met there a jazz saxophonist in America. And he was a much more accomplished composer than I ever was. So we did a cantata, and he did the music and I did the words, which was never published and won't ever see the light of day. But it was really about nuclear holocaust. And it was about ash, radioactive ash, and many other things. But that sort of desperate view of the world. And at that time I came quite closely connected with the beat generation that was in Paris. We went to Paris afterwards and met people like William Burroughs and I got very interested in the poetry of Gary Snyder. And Gary Snyder is a sort of anthropologist. Anyway.
Well, it sounds if you're writing about ash and so on, you're vaguely already quite political.
No, on the contrary, very, very unpolitical. Just, I mean, I'd become interested in anarchy, actually. I read quite often the journal called Liberty, was it? Anyway, a serious anarchist journal. And I was quite taken with it. But my interest was poetry, just poetry and art. That's it. And when I went to Oxford, I went to do Chinese. I mean, I went to do English, but I changed before I went there to do Chinese. And I got into Oxford while I was in the army. I not only went to the Guildhall, I went and did my college entrance from the army.
And they took you in with one A-level?
Yes, but on the basis of the college entrance and the interview. And I had extra Latin lessons in University College to be able to do that. And did I have to take O-level? I'd already done O-level in Latin, but I needed to do some extra because they tested you on it.
Why did you choose to do, or change from English to Chinese?
It was an act of, I guess, unacademic arrogance. I felt that I could learn what I needed to learn.
Well, why China? I mean, had you started reading books about China? Or do you
I
want some
had.
Chinese?
Thames and Hudson had published a book by Alan Watts
Oh, yes.
on Zen. The Way of Zen, it was called. And I was very taken with that. And I'd read Arthur Whaley's translations of Chinese poetry, and I'd realised that Zen was, I think, I must have realised already then, was Chan, and linked to Taoism. And I thought, oh yes, so that's what I want to learn, Chinese poetry then. Because I was interested in poetry as well. And I felt that to do a course on China, it didn't confine you to doing literature. You did history, philosophy, as well as literature of China, but anyway. And I felt that if I wanted to become a writer, still possibly a journalist, I could do that on my own. That's what I meant. It was arrogant. China was just more exotic. And it was sheer exoticism.
So how was your Oxford time? Were there significant people or?
Yes, there was very, very active. I was there. The most significant person at Oxford for me, academically, was David Hawkes. He was not exactly my tutor, but he helped me a lot. My tutor was a man called Wu Shichang, who
How
taught
do you spell that?
Wu, W-U,
Mm.
and then Shi, S-H-I-C-H-A-N-G.
Which
Who was
college were you at?
Queen's College.
Yeah.
But Wu Shichang wasn't at Queen's, I don't know what college he was attached to actually. But I had tutorials, most of my tutorials were with him for my specialities, which was poetry, tongue poetry. And he wasn't a tongue poetry expert, his expertise was in the story of the stone, the Hung but David Hawkes was the translator of the story of the stone. A fantastic translation, The Penguin, and I recommend it to anybody. And he led me to my first publication, I come to think of it, in my field. He'd been asked by a Ming collector, ceramics collector, to translate a poem on a certain kind of bowl, a certain kind of ware, blue and white ware, for an article to be published in Oriental Art. And he said, well, I won't do it, but I'll give it to one of my students. And it gave it to me. I was only in, I think, beginning my third year or something. You know, it's only a 3-year course. But it was a fantastic thing to be able to do. And so this was a Redcliffe's Sir, so it's a kind of poetry, by Sudham Pork, which, and there's a lot of Redcliffe ware. So that was my first publication. In Oriental Art, I published the whole of the poem. I mean, translated the whole of the poem. So, and David Hawkes disappeared. I mean, he completely disappeared in my last year, because he decided that in order to work on the translation of the story of the stone, he had to stop teaching, which was thoroughly admirable, I think. I mean, you know, just go away and do it. But he I liked. He and Wu Shichang were my two main influences.
Did you come across Anne Lonsdale at all?
No, the names.
She was mistress of Newhall here. And she specialised at Oxford in Tang poetry, but she was probably a little younger than you.
Yes.
She's just retired, so she must be in her late 60s now.
Right. No, I didn't come across.
And she went to China. Her interview, which I've done, is very interesting about her early trips to China in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
But I thought you might have seen.
No, the people I was at Oxford with was by far the largest year of students doing Chinese. It was 11 of us, and this was in 1958. So it's really very large for that time. And I don't think it was equal for another 10, 15 years. I don't quite know why it was such a big year, but...
Was Mark Elvin there then, or not?
No, he's younger. John Gittings, the man who became the editor, one of the foreign editors of The Guardian, leader writers for The Guardian, rather, and Bill Jenner, the historian and translator of Chinese. They were two of my colleagues. Co-students.
What about all the other things one does at university?
Oh yes, a lot. I mean, the journalism poetry thing kept going, and I tried to do too much. I wanted to play in my viola, and I wanted to act, and I wanted to write, and the former two fell by the wayside. And writing, I wrote poetry on the Poetry Society. Was a beat or a beatnik in my habits. But I then, with a friend called Geoffrey Cannon, took over a journal in Oxford called Oxford Opinion, which was a pretty ropey, thin thing, and we wanted to turn it into something much more substantial, and we did. It became, we had photo essays, we had film criticism, we had news articles, or articles about places in which sort of reviews of what was going on in whatever it was, in Africa or wherever, by people who were fellow undergraduates, but who were quite well informed, and it was completely redesigned it. So yes, and I published symposiums and that too. But I was mainly an editor, and then we took it out of Oxford when we both left and tried to make it a national magazine, and that was a tremendous time-wasting effort of getting advertising and stuff. It was called Evidence, and we put out one issue, and that was it. We couldn't keep it up.
By this time, you hadn't encountered anthropology, presumably. You didn't know.
No, not at all. And I went to work in the Chinese bookshop just opposite the British Museum.
Was this after you went down, you mean?
Yes. And I went to work there in the shop downstairs. The bookshop was run by a man called Charles Cohen, who not long after became a teacher of history, Chinese history, modern Chinese history at SOAS. Anyway, I worked there for a year while I tried to produce this journal. And I had a friend who's Malayan Chinese, and I felt, I don't know, partly through talking to him, and just realizing, it dawned on me in the first year, that I'd learned Chinese and I could read poems, but I couldn't speak. And I couldn't understand
Did
speech.
they not teach you any?
No, absolutely not. It was all classical Chinese, and I thought, this is truly absurd. I really need to be able to get to China. I need to be with Chinese people if I wanted to learn about China. And that's when I first found out about doing anthropology, because Maurice Friedman was one of the two poles of a thing called the London Cornell Fellowship.
Yes, I was a London Cornell scholar at one time.
Right.
That's how I went to Nepal. Yeah.
And I see. Right. And there were these fellowships. By that time, I was married with 2 children. By the way, I mean we married while I was still an undergraduate, and I needed a fellowship if I was going to go on and try to get to China. And there were these fellowships that offered people with Chinese to become anthropologists or vice versa. Well, not necessarily anthropology, I think there was other social sciences too. And so I applied and got the fellowship. The crucial point is that he told me, Morris did, that I couldn't get the fellowship unless I did a master's degree in anthropology first. So then I registered to do anthropology at LSE. But I had, through doing Chinese, met the person that I mentioned to you earlier today, Robert Reedman, who had been in the ambulance service on the Burma Road and had learned Chinese, and he gave me his Chinese dictionary. But he was a kind of partner with a man, but not in an open homosexual relationship, but in a close one, and they lived together. And the man was was Maitland Bradfield, who was a medical doctor and had become interested in archaeology and in anthropology.
I examined his PhD
Right.
on associations.
On association. So it came out as that book, The Natural History of Associations, 2 volumes.
That was his.
And he became a kind of early mentor in anthropology. He'd already become interested in the elementary structures of kinship of Levi-Strauss, and had done his own translation and summary of it, which he lent me. And I'd already begun reading Tris Tropiques, partly as a literary work, and found it deeply fascinating, and became, as it were, an anthropologist through Levi-Strauss. And that became the sort of anthropological love of my life. It became that which the sort of magic carpet I sailed on through LSE as well. I mean, I wrote a great deal about Levi-Strauss for Maurice Freeman's classes, and he didn't quite catch on to Levi-Strauss. So that,
he used to come into lectures and say, this is the latest Levi-Strauss, and translate bits on the hoof, so to speak. And
right.
it's very enthusiastic. I remember I went to some of those lectures too. But
right.
What date was this that you were?
I was at the LSE 64 to 66.
Yeah.
And I worked at Thames and Hudson to pay my way through, because I wasn't yet, hadn't got this fellowship yet. And I was working at Thames and Hudson as a picture editor and text editor.
Were there any anthropologists, apart from, well, say something more about Maurice, because he must have influenced you deeply.
Hugely, yes. Maurice, I liked him, and at the same time I felt a distance from him. We were so different, politically and in our, dress sense. He always felt to me verging on the side of pomposity. He armoured himself in his waistcoat, as how I think of it, and kept a distance between himself and his students. At the same time, he came over to the students extremely well. He taught fantastically well, and I enjoyed his seminars. And he and the other pole of the London Cornell Fellowship, Bill Skinner, he brought Bill Skinner over for a series of seminars he gave on his marketing systems theory, which was just about to be published, and that was fantastic. That was, I really felt invigorated to really know in a different way and about China in this way. So effectively they became my 2 models of how to learn about China. But Maurice's insistence on kinship and on the distinction between lineage and family, or kinship and family, and all those things I learned, but I didn't want to do them. I mean, I learnt them faithfully, and felt that, well, I was more interested in friendship and in territory and in neighbourhood. So I guess it was a kind of similar to what I did to my father. I just was anti-authoritarian and respected him, and I know that he respected me despite the fact that he knew that my politics was terrible. And despite the fact that at the LSE he stood at the gates and pointed people out who, forget about that, and I didn't like him for that. But he had this, I think, admirable capacity to say, I don't know what, I don't know what you're writing about. I don't, you're a good field worker. You did good field work. Your theory is beyond me. I don't know what it's all about, but I respect it for what you do with it. And that.
Was that when he was your PhD supervisor?
When he was my PhD supervisor, yes. And I have a real respect for him. And I hope I made that I realised that in co-editing a Festra for him after he died.
Mm. Was there anyone else that, I mean, it was a great generation. I came in the year you left, in '66.
Right.
And it was just the end of that great era of Lefurths and Lucy Mayer and Robin Fox and so on. Was there anyone else there who particularly influenced you in teaching?
Yes, Stephen Morris was my tutor. And I suppose because Barbara Ward, but was married to him, but yes, I did. Stephen Morris again was a fairly distant person. He kept a distance, but I liked him, and he I don't know, there was something. No, I don't know that there was anything apart from pluralism, which I got from him. And Morris also, his first dissertation, his master's dissertation was on pluralism. Well, yes, he used an early notion of pluralism for it. I should say that I became later very interested in race, and therefore picked that up again. But so that's Stephen Morris. But no, I mean, of all the teachers, of course, I was very affected by the presence of Raymond Firth and of Jean Lafontaine, but of Raymond Firth particularly, and sort of the seminars, the Friday seminars, which unusually, I mean, certainly it doesn't occur now, master's students could attend, and I did, and I didn't like the way in which he ran them. But
that's the going around each person.
Yes, and he had stereotypical notions of what each of us were. So I'd call upon John Davis, our resident historian, he would say, and so on. But he was terribly good at allowing someone to say something and then making something of it.
To continue, the LSE, you were there just before the Troubles, really, I suppose, '66. But you
Yes.
went on and did your PhD there, or?
Yes, I did. I went from there to, I got the Untitled Fellowship. I went to, I think I got the years wrong, by the way. It's '63 to '65 I was there. And then got the fellowship and spent a year in Cornell.
Your glasses off and for continuity.
Right. Sorry, a year in Cornell University learning Taiwanese. Because I'd thought of possibly doing field work. I knew I wanted to do it on religion. And I had already read a great deal about Chinese religion in English and French, and written a dissertation on feng shui, which eventually got published. But and I wanted to go on and do field work on religion. Knew I couldn't do it in the mainland, thought of doing it in Penang, and then decided that actually Taiwan was the best place to do it. And so I had to learn Taiwanese and went to Cornell to do that. And there I got very interested in phenomenological anthropology and in linguistic anthropology. There was a man called Charles Hockett teaching there, who knew some Chinese. But the main point of being there wasn't the anthropology, it was to learn Taiwanese. With, again, a fairly large cohort of students, the largest that I think there ever was to learn Taiwanese. And we all went to do field work, mainly anthropologists, but a couple of sociologists as well, in Taiwan in '66. And I had to come back for my father's funeral and then went on to Taiwan. And spent a year and a half in Taiwan doing fieldwork on religious change was the topic.
Can you remember your first arrival?
I do, yeah. I'd gone there under the auspices you had to have a sponsor of the Joint Commission for Rural Reconstruction, which is an extremely odd institution of state, joint between the US and Taiwan, or the Republic of China as it formerly called. But it was for basically agrarian extension and development. It was a development agency at the most senior level of government, equivalent to a ministry. And they sponsored, I think all of us, I'm not sure, they certainly sponsored me. And so I went on a trip with the JCCR, somebody arranged it, to find a field site. And there was a strange moment one evening in Puli, which is right in the center of Taiwan, up in the mountains, where in the evening we were walking down this street, and there were all kinds of stalls or just laid out on the paving, people offering haircuts or whatever it might be. And there was this person who had divination sticks, and he called out to me in Taiwanese, but I could understand it only just. Your father's just died. And so I thought, that's very uncanny, because he had. But then, because I'm very sceptical, I realised this, well, if he can guess a Western person's age, it's likely that someone my age may have happened to. I was already approaching 30. We didn't stop for me to have my fortune told by this person. But that was one uncanny moment. And the other one was where I'd sort of taken the lead in a bunch of us students finding our ways in one of the other places that we had been taken to. And I realized that although I could ask the way, I found it extremely difficult to understand the answer. Nearly got lost. So I realized that actually my language facility at that point needed much improvement before I could do proper field work.
How long did it take you until you could understand the answer as well as your question?
I guess 5 months. But in the meantime, of course, it was growing all that time. And my first 5 months I did fairly ordinary, repetitive things. I did a census of a small town I was in called Shading, and just went round every house and asked them who was living there and all the rest of it, which they must have thought was extremely curious. But they knew that there was this strange foreigner living in on an open balcony just under the roof of the temple with the teachers of the school, who had, some of them had quarters in the temple as well. And so they knew about me. So, and I went around talking to people about with fairly standard questions that I wanted to know from each other. And by the time 5 months was over, having done that and having been invited into their homes at the time of festivals, there already were a couple while I was in those 5 months. I think my Taiwanese by that time was pretty fluent. And at that point my family came to join me, my wife and 2 children, and moved to Taipei, because this is a small town deliberately chosen within reach of Taipei, because I wanted to see what people who from the small town, when they had moved to the city, how they changed their ritual habits, if at all, or how they kept their links with Shilin. So we lived in Taipei for 9 months, and then they left, and I stayed on for another 5 months, or 6 months, living with 2 Taiwanese friends in that point I had a very distorted vocabulary. I could do every day, but I could do Taoist ritual vocabulary better than most ordinary Taiwanese could. And I was studying Taoists at that point, the Taoists in a certain temple. And what I was interested in was the links between the linkages between temples and between people, between households, through a set of, in that case, Buddhist Buddhist brothers who did all the funerals and shooting, and in the area around, and the Taoists did all the jiao, the big refurbishment ceremonies for reopening of temples in a much bigger region of that part of Taiwan. And I went with them to the various places that did that. Not so many places, just 3, but they're big ceremonies. And so yeah, that was my fieldwork, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
You did?
Really loved it.
You weren't lonely or...
Sorry?
You weren't lonely or sick or...
No, I was never sick, although my American friends there kept on going to what's it called? The US Forces place, the equivalent of the British NAFI. They kept going there to buy their food and stuff like that, and I was living on street stalls. For some reason, possibly because I'd lived such a war baby childhood, that I didn't suffer from it. I felt lonely, that's for sure, in the first 5 months. I felt slightly persecuted by the children, with whom, of course, were the first people I got on with. My level of language was more like theirs, I suppose. But the children were... there was one particular child who I really liked, but he was a leader of these between 5 and 8 year olds in a gang. They just wandered very wildly around this small town. And Tigua was his name, and that means iron ox. Iron ox was also the name for these small ploughs, tractors that pulled ploughs. And he was a really burly little fellow. And I used to borrow the space that a teacher lived in, who liked me to help him with his English. He wanted to learn English. And he would allow me to be in his room where I would put my typewriter to type out my notes. And while I was there, the children would come outside and sort of shout through the crack in the door, Tuabina, which means big nose, or Bigalang, or American. I said, I'm not an American, I'm an Englishman. But they would, in that way, sort of persecute me in a way, and I felt, this is silly being persecuted by children, but I did feel slightly persecuted. Yeah.
What was it like having a wife and your own children there?
That was
good idea.
A great idea, yes. I mean, poor Miranda felt very isolated. She didn't speak any Chinese, and she didn't have anything to do. And we, both our children, the younger of the 2 children at the time, we had another one subsequently, but Anna, the youngest, was at home all day. Cordelia I took to school, but it was an American school, because she'd already been to an American school in Cornell. And so Miranda was stuck at home, and one of my best older informants' daughters came to our house to help her learn Chinese, which she did a bit, and that was some. But what she loved, and which was great for me too, was to come to the funerals and festivals that I went to. And people just thought I was human. They saw that Miranda was there, and our children came too.
What did you find out? I mean, what was the conclusion of this?
Well, what I wanted to find out was how religion changed. But it was it was a dilemma that I think everybody must have when they're coming to something new as this was to me. But first of all, I had to understand what was not changing before I could understand what was changing. And that's how can I do that at the same time? And so I think what I learned was through a kind of intensive version of what I'd already been doing at school sermons, of observing a huge amount, writing an enormous number of notes and trying to think, how does this make sense? What kind of sense does it make? And what is being repeated here that was done the previous year or whatever, because I stayed for a whole annual cycle, of course. And basically I was still pretty Levi-Straussian, so I wanted to find out what the structure of it all was. And I think I did achieve that. But what I didn't really achieve was the sense of the change. That came a long time later. And I think what I achieved then was what I eventually published as the book Imperial Metaphor, which came out in the second edition as Popular Religion in China, was a sense of territorial cults and territoriality as such, as a ritually defined thing, as having certain ritual elements that you could find with variations of what those elements might be, but you could find, I think what I was able to detect were certain kind of procession festivals as being true of the whole of China, the whole of the rest of China, not just Taiwan. And of course against that I was accused of being, treating Taiwan as being Chinese, and when it wasn't, because it's just Taiwanese. Or even though I used Taiwanese transliterations in Taiwanese, of Taiwanese. So I was accused of that by two people who accused all of us who were doing anthropology of China in Taiwan, of doing the anthropology of China in Taiwan, which it's a justified accusation.
It was made against Friedman as well, wasn't it?
Well, Morris didn't ever do field work in Taiwan, but
in the new territories.
But in the new territories, it's true. But Morris never claimed to be doing more than the anthropology of the two provinces, Guangdong and Fujian. He then wrote things about an old state, meaning the whole of China, but that's just its politics. He never claimed to generalize about lineages over the whole of China. And I keep telling people this, and that they've set up a straw Friedman.
So you came back from this to write up at the LSE with Morris.
I did with Morris, but I'd in order partially to save fees, I was, but also because I was in a generation that was like a golden age. I was offered two jobs while I was still doing fieldwork in Taiwan. One was to become a lecturer in what was it called, Asian anthropology at SOAS, and the other was from Arthur Wolff to take up a Ford Fellowship at Cornell, where he was then. Instead, I did take a small Ford grant, two small Ford grants. One was to organise for him a fieldwork seminar of every one of us who was doing fieldwork in Taiwan and Hong Kong, in Taiwan. And the other was for Bill Skinner, to do work for library research in Taiwan and then in Tokyo and at the Library of Congress, on gazetteers, on ritual and ritual institutions in cities two cities were Taipei and Ningbo, which I then were my earliest publications for Bill Skinner's city books, and didn't take the job.
I was wondering if you were tempted by either of those jobs.
I took the one in Sellers.
You did?
Yeah. So partly the reason this was an explanation of why Morris gave me, as it were, free tuition, because I was at that point registered just with the University of London, not with the LSE. And his supervision was pretty minimal at the time. It was just, I would send him chapters, he would correct the grammar, that was it. And I was already trying to teach anthropology at Sellers while I was writing. So
This was about 67, 68?
I came back in 68, of all years to come back in. I remember being in New York at the time of the occupation of Columbia University, and the students sitting on the walls of Columbia University saying, in their incredible insularity, I thought, Paris has come out, as it were, for us.
And the other sea.
Yes. So I came back into that, having basically in Taiwan, it dawned on me that I was actually working under a military dictatorship. And a very close friend there was in the army then. I visited him in his barracks on the east coast of Taiwan, and realized that his sympathies were probably for Taiwan independence, but he could barely admit it to even me. And we shared, we'd been sharing a room by that time for 5 months. So, that there were things going on that people dared speak about in that atmosphere, and that politicized me a little bit, just a little bit.
Did the fact that you were slightly north of Vietnam also politicize you at all?
Yes. I'd already gone on demonstrations against the war at Cornell. At the time I didn't have a set politics, I was just against that war. And I didn't feel more than it was wrong. And so the school we sent our eldest child to was a missionary school, not a military school for Americans. And there were lots of people, lots of GIs doing Western recreation in Taipei when we were living there. I mean, I wasn't against them. In fact, I struck up an odd relationship at the time in Taiwan with the naval attaché for the American embassy there, because he knew, I don't know how I met him actually, but he knew how to get marijuana. And so we would smoke together. It was only on a couple of occasions. And he was very interested in Buddhism, and he taught me how to meditate. He taught me how to meditate. And then I lost touch with him altogether until one day, many, many years later, a very beautiful book of sutras was sent to me by this person whom I didn't recognize at all. He'd taken a Buddhist name. And then I realized it's him, from California, right?
I mean, someone who was also against the war in Vietnam and also the politicization of anthropologists was Arthur Wolff, who you mentioned, and an important worker on Taiwan. Do you know Arthur well?
I do.
So
I mean, I knew both Bill and Arthur, but they split in the most awful way. And so
they split?
Well, they split. They became antagonists at Stanford. We were both there. And then Arthur again was involved in the splitting of the anthropology department itself at Stanford. I mean, Bill Skinner moved elsewhere, moved to Davis. And Arthur, but I know both of them. Well, Bill Skinner's dead now, but I do know Arthur well. And went to all their lectures at Cornell when I was there. So Arthur lectured on psychological anthropology, and I went to them. But Arthur, he may have been against the war, but he's very strictly unpoliticized anthropologist.
Didn't he write that famous article, Anthropologists on the Warpath, which was about the secret funding of the CIA?
In Thailand? No, that was somebody else.
Was it?
Yes, that's Eric Wolf.
Eric Wolf. Oh, yes,
Right.
That's right.
No, Arthur wasn't like that. And Arthur, Arthur's work on religion, although I didn't agree with it, was a really pioneering work. God's Ghosts and Scholars, God's Ghosts and Ancestors, and I was there when he gave it as a paper, and was very influenced by it.
And what about Marjorie Wolf?
Yeah, well, Marjorie was. Firstly, I went to their field site after they'd left, and that was where one of these big jiao were in Shulin that I went to see, and I was introduced there, as it were, through them, and Marjorie's book, The House of Lim, the first of her books, which came out while I was at SOAS, I think it's a wonderful book, a really great book of in-depth and very, familiar, making a Chinese family familiar. But before that, though I never became interested for myself to do research, I thought that their work on childhood was extremely good, very, very interesting, and that Arthur's, I think it was mainly Arthur, but it must have been Marjorie too, on how I then saw my own childhood, as it were, as on that transition to when the father begins to stop treating their child especially their son, as someone to indulge, and then has to start teaching them to be, as it were, a son. That moment is a very, very stark moment in Taiwan, and they described it extremely well.
Coming back to SOAS, you seem always to be about 2 years ahead of me. I went to SOAS actually in '68, but I was just a PhD student starting off there. But you were there with again at the end of a great generation of anthropologists.
I took Mendelssohn's place. And he was somebody I sort of admired. I thought his writings or expositions of Levi-Strauss were fantastically good, and the way in which he wanted to work poetry into his anthropology was, I thought, thoroughly worth attempting to emulate, but I never did. But his course that he taught became the course that I taught, and it was my best teaching experience. It was basically a reading group. It was advanced theory. And he'd chosen these classics, which I varied only a little bit. It's just a series of classic anthropological texts that everybody had to read, plus all the rereadings and redoings of the anthropology of those classics. Each week, a new one. And I thought it was the most wonderful way of teaching theory. So I did it. I did exactly the same as he did it. And so that was an influence of somebody I never met and who wasn't there. But the person, of course, that became my bugbear was Christoph von Führer-Heinendorf. But the people there that Barbara Ward became a sort of auntie figure for me. Abner Cohen he had his rather over rigidly dualistic theory of everything, but it was very, really exciting to see him working it out and just be at seminars with him.
Adrian Mayer.
and Adrian Mayer, yes.
Mm.
So, I mean, being at SOAS, much more than being an postgraduate at the LSE, meant not just learning. Well, first of all, it meant learning about India, and I didn't know anything about India before that. And von Führer-Heimdorf was one of those who, as it were, doing that, he and Adrian. But the way in which he ran his seminars seemed to me to be so inferior to the way that Raymond had.
Mm.
I mean, he just didn't have either the intellect for it or the energy for it. I don't know. He always went to sleep.
Yes, I remember. But apart from that, why was he your bugbear? Apart from
Because I was a troublemaker,
Mm.
and he was on the side of the directorate.
he was an acting director at some point, wasn't he?
No, he may have been something senior,
Mm.
but it was Phillips was the director all the way through.
He
that time.
acted, I think, a year when he was away or something.
Right.
But it was you're not wearing ties and going to the restaurant without.
Yes, and Barbara told me to go to the senior common room more often and to wear jackets and ties, and I thought, yes, that's fine, but I should distance myself from the students. Christoph told me I should do. She agreed with it, because I'd written something on SOAS, School of Imperialism, it was called. With an undergraduate and a postgraduate, and this silly young lecturer, in which was not a well-researched piece of work. There were factual mistakes in it, which I then had to apologise for. These are factual mistakes, and I had to put that out as another publication. But anyway, I was a troublemaker, and as soon as that came out, I think Phillips was overheard to say at some meeting I wasn't there, that this man has to go. And Christoph von Führer-Heimdorf was part of that, wanted me to go. The only funny story, though it wasn't that funny at the time, was that when I was made to go, the reason for which I went was that I was just not given tenure. Right, I had 5 years probation and my contract wasn't renewed. He said, I'll write you a very good reference, there's a very good job going in Papua New Guinea.
With a one-way ticket.
Yes, quite. So I thought, yes, thank you. And I got a job at the City University and became a sociologist.
It was about that time that another person I've interviewed, David Seven,
Oh yes.
also
He and I tried to start a magazine as well.
and David fell out with Christoph as well.
He did indeed at the same time.
Went off to UEA.
To UEA, where he still is.
Still
Yes.
is, yes. I just interviewed him recently. So I was obviously a conformist or something. I had Indian blood in me. And we got on okay, but he was getting towards the end of his...
Yes, he was.
He'd set up the whole department about 20 years earlier, and it was his last years.
Right.
And Piers Videbski was there as well.
Was he? I didn't know that. I wish I'd known that, because I only met him later.
No, Piers was there just... I think Piers and I fight over whether we were Christoph's last student together, so
I see.
it must have been about the same time. So the next move was to the City University.
Yes, but I kept on doing research on China, and I kept on being an anthropologist. I taught a historical introduction to anthropology there. And I missed being in an anthropological context very much. But I did become very interested, as I had already at SOAS, in the whole relationship between racism in the UK and the history of imperialism, British imperialism. And that by that time I while I was at SOAS, I'd already written what is my first anthropological publication, which was in Talal Asad's Anthropology and Colonial Encounter. And I'd done some research at the RAI and various other places on the relationship between indirect rule and the wish of anthropologists to be serving in ways that I realized were thoroughly ambivalent, both being of use to a colonial regime but also critical of it. And so that was, so I tried to set, as it were, anthropology into a rather broadly defined ideological and political context there, and got into bad odour with a lot of anthropologists for that, but obviously not with Talal. In fact, Talal had already been organising a set of seminars, and I was organising some seminars on imperialism and anthropology, just informal. And we put the two together into this book, or the best of them. But he was the main editor. So at the City University, I took over a course on the sociology of race, which I turned into my own syllabus for it. I didn't do the same as I inherited, as I had done when I went to SOAS. And that became a major interest. I didn't do fieldworks, but I did pretty intense work on the police, for instance, on police racism, and what was then and still is called canteen culture in the Metropolitan Police in particular. And there's an extraordinary number of policemen who became anthropologists, who did field work, as it were, on their police work. And they're really very, very interesting. And published edited a number of books in which I wrote chapters on racism and anti-racism.
I mean, just to go back one step, looking back on that imperialism, colonialism and anthropology view that you had then on Talal Asad and that famous volume, I mean, do you think that most of what you said at the time still holds, or was it overdrawn as a reaction? Or
no, I think people thought it was more drawn than it was. I mean, if I read back at it, which I do still agree with it, yes. Because I think I was conscious of the fact that it was ambivalent. But there is something about, people are still doing the same sort of thing. Alan Chan, for instance, writes pretty similar things about Hong Kong anthropology as I was doing more generally about African, mainly African. But I also brought Papua New Guinea into it for some reason. I can't now remember what I was doing that for. Maybe that was another attempted publication, which I didn't do. But I don't think it was wrong. I think there are points at which the conclusions became too strident. But my main argument was to look at what it might have been possible to write at the time of the writing. Not to say it should have been, and then sort of reading back into it something from later. So I wanted to look at, what might it have been possible to write in Africa, about Africa, at the time that Fortis was writing about the Tenensi. And my main criticism was it could have been a damn sight more historical. So why was it so unhistorical? I then tried to figure out, why was it? But I also wanted to think about, why did Malinowski refer to upstart natives? That's a quote. What was it that could allow an anthropologist to write that? That's what I was trying to do.
His diary had just come out in '67, reading that, which was a terrible shock to me, the racist, obvious racism in there, and arrogance and patronising attitude in general, was appalling. I mean, I didn't expect that at all. So, I mean, this is also, I mean, Evans Pritchard also is accused of, basically leaving out things. Nothing that he put in was wrong, but
no, but leaving out things so that what's put in the, I mean, it's all there. It's actually in the preface. The fact that the Nua got strafed. But why isn't that a significant ethnographic fact? Because, and then I found myself doing it when I went to Taiwan, because actually it's very difficult to do history. I mean, it's not for you, but I mean, it may not be for you, but to be able to say, these are the institutions that have changed, and that are themselves the result of change, I find it's a really challenging thing to do. And it's what I now want to do on a huge time scale, but, using the concept of civilization. But but at the time I found it really difficult, and now I can sympathise with it, which I couldn't at the time. That much I'll admit to. I didn't sympathise with it.
That's what I was wondering, really.
Right.
And you understand it as well as criticising it. Well, that last thing you talked about sounded rather exciting. What is this large?
Well, because I do have done so much with Wang Mingming.
Yeah. Well, tell me about Wang Mingming, because
Right.
there's an interview about him.
Yes, I'd like to talk about Wang Mingming. Wang Mingming was in London doing his PhD at SOAS. On some of his books in Chinese, I believe he calls me his supervisor, which I wasn't. But in a way, it's a sort of a Chinese way of speaking about somebody senior, senior to them. But I met him through, as he rightly said in his interview, the London China Seminar, which I was organising while I was at City University, but which held its meetings in SOAS. And I realised that this extraordinary student was doing something so close to what I myself had done. You know, he was interested in festivals. Nobody else was. And what's more, they were in Quanzhou, which is where the people that I'd studied came from. So we had big mutual interest. And I was very excited about that. And I mean, the way in which he was doing it was very much influenced by people that I didn't have that much time for at SOAS, but it's sort of very post-structuralist, and I'd already read most of what they read and was using them in different ways. And and he was also looking at things that I didn't know and couldn't know anything about, which was the relationship between the revived local festivals of Quanzhou's neighbourhoods and the official festivals, as it were, state rituals of the PRC. But in any case, I was interested in his work, interested in the paper he gave, and then when I got a big grant from the ESRC to do, I knew I couldn't do studies of religion even then, in late 80s, early 90s. I got a grant to do mutual support systems, which I knew when I went to visit the field sites myself, it was all done by Chinese colleagues. And one of them was Wang Mingming. When I went to actually see his field site, we could do some religion study, which we did in Meifa, the village, and Kamdong as well, but in Meifa. And to cut a long story short, this was therefore a relationship that's now 20 years old. He has enabled me to rejuvenate my Chinese anthropology. I have to say that. I know he's very, I know that I can contribute something to him, but he's contributed an enormous amount to me through doing joint field work, mainly. But he does more of it than I do. I mean, I come in for short visits, he's there for much longer. And then since then, just by constantly being invited by him to come and, in a senior capacity, to be commenting on students' work and stuff like that. But through that influence, to cut this, to come back round to the point that you're asking about, you can't be with Wang Wing for very long without becoming more and more historically conscious. And it was embarrassing when he went and did field work in Sheding for another joint project that we did, that he got the money for. Well, we jointly did, but it was his idea initially, which came out as the book Grassroots Charisma, in which he did field work in my original fieldwork place, and to Mayfar, where we'd both been before for this other mutual support study. It was a comparison of similar religious culture but completely different regimes, political regimes and economies. He immediately, within 2 months, he'd found out more about the history of Sheding than I knew was even there, right? And I thought, oh, it's not just linguistic. I mean, it is largely that too. It's an immediate instinct he has for looking for genealogies, for whatever it might be. And he did the same thing on the mutual support study. I mean, his first thing was not actually to look at mutual support. He did the questionnaire, that's all I asked him to do, but what he did immediately was to find out the history of Mayfar. So, and then, and so what does he talk about? He talks about Chinese civilization. What is that? How do we, as anthropologists, think about that? And now I'm really involved in it as a concept. And I began working with Mike Rowlands at UCL, who is an Africanist and a Mediterraneanist to some extent. And we are working on, we've now given a number of lectures on Wang Wingming's invitation in Beijing, and I'm going to give a similar one, the most worked out one, for China, on the concept of civilization and Chinese civilization at Fudan University in 2 weeks' time. And it's looking at the really long term of material culture mainly, but for me I always want to go beyond the material culture, compared to Mike, who's trained as an archaeologist as well as an anthropologist. And Wang Wingming was trained as an archaeologist as well as an anthropologist. So we're reviving the concept of civilization developed by Mus, Marcel Mus, and trying to rethink all that was done by diffusionism and ethnology, but then but without any ethnocentrism and without a universal evolutionist perspective. So the challenge is to be able to see continuity and radical transformation all at the same time. What is it that continues? Does it become a vehicle for change, or for learning new things? And all this over periods of change that can last hundreds of years. That's the project, the Comparative Civilizations project.
Fascinating. So many things to talk about, but so little time, as they say. I mean, looking at China in this long time span, some people think that the Maoist period was like many other sort of small blips.
Exactly.
And that there's much that is continuous underneath.
Yes, and so you're absolutely right to ask the question. I ask it for myself. And I gave a lecture at the LSE, a public lecture, a few weeks ago on precisely this question. It's in a series called After 30 Years of Reform. And I realized that Maoism was actually, as a state, less than 30 years. So I was asking myself, is Maoism just a blip? And doing it, as it were, in public. And no, the answer to... because Maoism was so extraordinary, he likened himself to Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. And Qin Shi Huangdi was only 25 years as well, but had an enormous influence. Now, I don't think Mao was going to have that kind of influence. He thought he was going to be far superior to Qin Shi Huangdi. He actually said, trouble with Qin Shi Huangdi was he was just an emperor, whereas I have the people on my side, and therefore what we did is going to be much more lasting than what Qin Shi Huangdi did. Not true, in my opinion, but nevertheless, the state that he established in China, which is still the current state, although it's not Maoist any longer, there are certain institutions like the Chinese Communist Party itself, like certain ways of working as a political organization, with work teams that make investigations or implement policy. And when they made their investigations, it becomes policy later on. Like sort of the mechanics of what Mao called the mass line are still going on, through 30 years of reform. So I don't think it is just a blip. There are many other reasons, but
I mean, if you believe that there's a deep continuity over, say, to a couple of thousand years in Chinese history, and then you get Manchus and Mongolians and so on and so on, disturbing it for 50, 100 years, and then it goes. Do you think that deep continuity has been broken? In other words,
often.
But now with the Maoist.
The Maoist break was probably the biggest, but there have been so many breaks during the Republican era before that. I mean, the extent of destruction was probably greatest in the Cultural Revolution, but under the Kuomintang there was immense zeal to destroy temples, to turn them into schools and all the rest of it. So there have been periods of iconoclasm before that in China, as you know, but there are certain things that seem to me to be continuous, although their content may have changed. Something of them remains. So, for instance, my shortest definition of Chinese civilization is, as I think I told you in Quanzhou, is sage rule and self-cultivation. And I think that still goes on. Mao and Chiang Kai-shek were, as it were, rivals for being the sage who ruled China. It's trite to say it just like that, but the notion of a moral leadership is quite peculiar to China. I don't think it's true of every other civilization. And the notion of self-cultivation through bodily techniques or feng shui or whatever, and the cosmology that goes with it of balance, is still true. It's true in Qigong, and it was true through different techniques all the way back from the time of Zhuangzi.
We're just coming to the end of our second tape, but I wondered if there was anything that you would like me to have asked you and talked to about a little bit. Your family, your wife, your children, your home life, your future plans, whatever.
Yeah, I think yes, I do want to trace through my life one further thing. My interest in place and on spatial formation, to which I've now added the idea that one ought to be able to look at different senses of place. I wrote the introduction, a theoretical introduction, plus one chapter to a book called Making Place, about Chinese ways of making place. Is an extension of my interest in feng shui, in which I now want to add not only to the fact that different people have different senses of the same place, which they each center for themselves, but which they have joint sense of centeredness, is also a different senses of time about that and different senses of the histories that run into it. And I want to be able to develop that in the future. And I'm writing something now for the second in a series of workshops that Laura Baer at the LSE and I are basically the organisers of. It's called Conflicts in Time, but it's also about different senses of time, which I'm calling temporalities. And that project is another ongoing one, not just for civilization one. And I'm currently writing for this workshop, which is to occur at the end of next week in Edinburgh, a joint paper with Laura Pan, if you remember her from Tranjo, who did work with the Municipal Planning Bureau in Tranjo on planning in Tranjo. But you know, a plan is never achieved, and what it has to get mixed up with is what's so interesting. And it includes different people's senses of the place they're in and their histories and their sense of future as well, of course.
Well, mentioning the future is a nice point to end. I hope this conversation will continue next time, perhaps in China. Who knows?
Yes, I hope so too, yes.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you,
Stephan.
Alan.